Chief Justice John Roberts explodes on Jasmine Crockett. Her ice-cold reply breaks the internet. The Supreme Court chamber fell into stunned silence as Chief Justice John Roberts, his face flushed with uncharacteristic anger, leaned forward at the bench. The annual Judicial Conference hearing before the House Judiciary Committee had been tense but professional until Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, the second-term Democrat from Texas, posed a series of increasingly pointed questions about the court's ethics standards and recent controversial decisions. "Congresswoman," Roberts said, his voice rising with each word, "I have sat here patiently while you have repeatedly mischaracterized this court's decisions and impugned the integrity of the justices. Your suggestion that this court is somehow acting as a political body rather than following the Constitution is not just incorrect. It is a dangerous attack on a fundamental institution of American democracy." The Chief Justice's outburst, extraordinary from a man known for his careful temperament and institutional caution, sent shockwaves through the chamber. Committee members from both parties seemed frozen in place, unsure how to respond to this unprecedented breakdown of the careful choreography that typically governs interactions between the judicial and legislative branches. For a moment, even Congresswoman Crockett appeared, taken aback by the intensity of Roberts' response. The former civil rights attorney sat silently for several seconds, gathering her thoughts as all eyes in the room focused on her. The tension was palpable as everyone waited to see whether she would escalate the confrontation or attempt to diffuse it. What happened next stunned everyone in the chamber and would soon captivate millions online. Rather than matching Roberts' emotion or backing down from her position, Crockett delivered a response so measured, so precisely targeted, and so devastating in its calm clarity that the Chief Justice's expression visibly shifted from righteous indignation to something approaching professional respect, mixed with genuine concern. By the time she finished speaking, the dynamic between the two legal minds had completely transformed. What began as an emotional confrontation had evolved into something far more substantive. A fundamental debate about the court's role in American democracy that would soon have the entire legal community and public re-examining long-held assumptions about judicial independence and accountability. This wasn't just another political clash. It was about to become a defining moment in the relationship between America's highest court and the democratic institutions designed to check its power. If you're interested in seeing how powerful figures respond when their authority is challenged with facts rather than emotions, you'll want to watch this entire breakdown. Hit that like button and subscribe to our channel right now to see more moments where preparation and substantive knowledge triumph over institutional authority. Let's dive into what really happened when Chief Justice Roberts exploded on Congresswoman Crockett and how her ice-cold reply broke the internet. Chief Justice John Roberts had long been regarded as the consummate institutional steward. At 69, the Harvard-educated lawyer had spent nearly 2 decades leading the Supreme Court with a careful approach that balanced his own conservative judicial philosophy with a deep concern for the court's reputation and legitimacy. Known for his crisp writing, strategic compromise on divisive issues, and unfailing courtesy even in disagreement, Roberts had rarely displayed the kind of emotion that characterized his outburst at the Judiciary Committee hearing. The annual appearance before the committee had traditionally been a relatively routine affair focused on the court's budget, administrative matters, and general discussions of the judicial system rather than specific cases or controversies. However, recent years had seen increasing tensions as the court's conservative majority issued rulings on voting rights, executive power, and regulatory authority that dramatically shifted American law to the right, prompting growing demands for greater transparency and ethical guardrails. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett represented a new generation of lawmakers bringing professional legal expertise to Congress. Before her election, she had built a successful career as a civil rights attorney in Texas, where she had won several high-profile cases challenging voting restrictions and police misconduct. Her legal background made her questioning particularly pointed, as she approached the Chief Justice not as a political opponent, but as a fellow legal professional, with substantive concerns about the court's jurisprudence and institutional practices. The House Judiciary Committee hearing room was packed beyond capacity that morning. Supreme Court reporters, constitutional law professors, and political observers crowded the press section. while a long line of citizens waited outside, hoping for a chance to witness the rare public appearance of the Chief Justice. The recent controversy surrounding undisclosed gifts to several justices from wealthy political donors had heightened interest in what would normally have been a relatively dry administrative hearing. The session had begun cordially enough, with Chairman Jim Jordan welcoming the Chief Justice and expressing appreciation for his willingness to appear before the committee. The first hour had focused primarily on court administration, judicial security concerns, and the ongoing effort to increase public access to court proceedings through live audio and potential video coverage of arguments. The tone shifted when questioning turned to Crockett, who began by asking about the court's approach to recusal decisions, specifically, the practice of allowing individual justices to decide for themselves when conflicts of interest require stepping aside from cases. Chief Justice Roberts, Crockett began, her tone professional but direct. Unlike every other federal court in the country, Supreme Court justices make their own recusal decisions without review. Given the recent revelations about undisclosed gifts and travel from parties with interest before the court, would you support creating a more formal, transparent process for addressing potential conflicts of interest? Roberts responded with his typical measured approach, emphasizing the unique constitutional position of the Supreme Court while acknowledging the importance of ethical standards. But as Crockett pressed further, citing specific instances where justices had participated in cases involving apparent conflicts, the Chief Justice's responses grew increasingly defensive. The tension escalated when Crockett shifted to questioning recent decisions that had overturned long-standing precedents on voting rights and regulatory authority. Chief Justice, she said, in Shelby County versus Holder, you wrote that the country has changed as justification for striking down key provisions of the Voting Rights Act. Yet in the decades since, we've seen hundreds of voting restrictions enacted in states previously covered by those provisions. Given this evidence, do you still maintain that racial discrimination in voting is no longer a significant problem requiring federal oversight? It was this line of questioning, directly challenging the factual basis of his landmark opinion, that appeared to breach Roberts' normally impeccable self-control, leading to his uncharacteristic outburst about Crockett mischaracterizing court decisions and impugning the justice's integrity. The chamber fell silent after Roberts' emotional response. For several seconds, Crockett sat perfectly still, her expression revealing nothing of her internal reaction to being publicly rebuked by the Chief Justice of the United States. When she finally spoke, her voice was remarkably calm and measured, a stark contrast to Roberts' emotional display. "Thank you for that perspective, Chief Justice," she began, maintaining direct eye contact with Roberts. "I want to be clear that my questions are not intended to impugn anyone's personal integrity, but rather to address substantive concerns about the court's approach to its constitutional role and ethical obligations." She paused briefly before continuing, her tone remaining steady and professional. "When I cite specific cases like Shelby County, I'm not mischaracterizing the court's decision, but directly quoting your majority opinion and highlighting the empirical consequences that have followed. Over 1,600 polling places have been closed in jurisdictions previously covered by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and 26 states have enacted new voting restrictions since that decision. These are not partisan talking points, but documented facts from the Brennan Center for Justice and the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights." As she spoke, Crockett maintained perfect composure, never raising her voice or showing signs of being rattled by Roberts' outburst. Instead, she methodically laid out a substantive critique of the court's recent jurisprudence that focused not on ideology, but on the gap between the court's stated reasoning and the real-world consequences that had followed. Similarly, Chief Justice, when I raise questions about recusal standards, I'm not suggesting improper motives, but addressing a structural concern that affects the court's institutional legitimacy. The principle that no one should be the judge in their own case is fundamental to our legal system. Yet the current approach effectively asks justices to do exactly that when deciding whether their own relationships or interests require recusal. She referenced a stack of documents on the table before her. "I have here the recusal standards that apply to every other federal judge in America. as well as the ethics rules governing members of Congress and executive branch officials. All include external review mechanisms rather than leaving these decisions entirely to the individual's discretion. Is the Supreme Court truly the only institution in our government where self-regulation is sufficient? As Crockett continued her methodical, evidence-based response, a remarkable transformation began to occur in Roberts' demeanor. The flushed anger that had characterized his outburst gradually gave way to a more thoughtful expression as he listened to her substantive points. It was clear that he had expected a political counterattack to his emotional response, not this calm dissection of judicial principles and documented facts. The most powerful moment came when Crockett concluded her response by directly addressing Roberts' concern about attacks on the court's legitimacy. Chief Justice, you expressed concern that questioning the court's decisions undermines a fundamental institution of American democracy. With respect, I would suggest that the opposite is true. Our constitutional system explicitly creates checks and balances between the branches. Congressional oversight of the judiciary isn't an attack on the court. It's exactly how the system is designed to function. She closed her portfolio before delivering her final point. The greatest threat to the court's legitimacy isn't respectful questioning from Congress or criticism from legal scholars. It's the perception that the court has become disconnected from both constitutional principles and the practical realities facing American citizens. My questions today aren't meant to undermine the court, but to strengthen it by addressing concerns shared by legal experts across the political spectrum and by the majority of Americans who ultimately must have faith in the court's impartiality for its decisions to be accepted as legitimate. The chamber remained silent as Crockett concluded. For a moment, Roberts seemed unsure how to respond to this unexpectedly substantive rebuttal. When he finally spoke, his tone had completely changed from his earlier emotional outburst. "Congresswoman," he said, his voice now measured and thoughtful, "you raised several points that deserve serious consideration. While I may disagree with some of your characterizations, I appreciate the substantive nature of your concerns. The court's legitimacy depends on public confidence, and we should all be mindful of how our institutions are perceived." He continued with what observers would later describe as a remarkable concession from the normally circumspect Chief Justice. "Regarding recusal procedures specifically, I acknowledge there may be room for greater transparency in how these decisions are made. While I maintain that the court's unique constitutional position creates different considerations than for lower courts, your point about external review mechanisms is not without merit and deserves further discussion." The exchange that had begun as an emotional confrontation had transformed into something far more significant. A substantive dialogue about judicial accountability that acknowledged legitimate concerns while maintaining appropriate institutional respect. As the chairman moved to recognize the next committee member, cameras caught Roberts making notes on his legal pad, a sign that Crockett's points had genuinely registered rather than being dismissed. The aftermath was immediate and far-reaching. Even before the hearing concluded, clips of the exchange were spreading across social media platforms at extraordinary speed. Watch Reps to Crockett's ice-cold takedown of Chief Justice Roberts became one of the most viewed political videos of the year, accumulating over 30 million views within 24 hours. What made the clip particularly compelling, and what drove its viral spread far beyond typical political content, wasn't just the dramatic confrontation between two powerful figures. It was the stark contrast between Roberts' emotional response and Crockett's composed, substantive rebuttal. A masterclass in how to respond to authority with facts rather than matching emotion. This wasn't just good political theater, noted a CNN legal analyst that evening. It was one of the most significant exchanges between the judicial and legislative branches in recent memory. Congresswoman Crockett effectively challenged the Chief Justice not as a partisan opponent, but as a constitutional officer raising legitimate institutional concerns. Legal blogs and law school discussion boards erupted with analysis of the confrontation. Roberts v. Crockett, Constitutional Dialogue in Real Time, became the headline of a widely shared analysis on SCOTUS blog, examining how the exchange had illuminated fundamental questions about judicial review, congressional oversight, and the evolving relationship between the branches of government. For constitutional scholars, The moment represented something more significant than a typical political clash. What we witnessed wasn't just Crockett responding effectively to Roberts' outburst, observed a law professor at Yale. It was a rare public articulation of the genuine constitutional tension between judicial independence and democratic accountability, a tension the framers built into our system precisely to prevent any branch from becoming too powerful. For Roberts, the exchange presented both a challenge and an opportunity. Known for his concern with the court's institutional reputation, he recognized that his emotional response had not served that cause well. In a move that surprised many court watchers, he addressed the confrontation directly in a speech at the American Law Institute 2 weeks later. At a recent congressional hearing, I responded more emotionally than was appropriate to questioning about the court's decisions, Roberts acknowledged to the gathered legal scholars. Upon reflection, while I maintain that the court must be defended against unfair criticism, I recognize that respectful questioning from co-equal branches of government is not only appropriate, but essential to our constitutional system. He continued with what many interpreted as a direct response to Crockett's substantive points. The court's legitimacy ultimately rests on public confidence in our impartiality and adherence to constitutional principles. We should welcome good faith dialogue about how to maintain that confidence, even when it involves criticism of our decisions or institutional practices. This unusual public acknowledgement, almost an apology from the nation's highest judicial officer, only amplified interest in the exchange and its implications for judicial accountability. For Crockett, the viral moment elevated her national profile dramatically. Law schools and policy institutes invited her to speak about both the substantive issues she had raised and her approach to institutional dialogue. Sunday morning political shows that had previously overlooked the second-term representative now sought her commentary on constitutional issues and the relationship between governmental branches. What Congresswoman Crockett demonstrated wasn't just political skill, noted a Washington Post analysis. It was a deep understanding of how constitutional dialogue between branches should function. By responding to emotional reaction with substantive argument, she elevated what could have been a merely dramatic moment into a genuinely significant constitutional discussion. In a profile published 3 weeks after the hearing, Crockett reflected on the unexpected impact of her exchange with Roberts. I approached that hearing as a constitutional officer, doing my job, not looking for confrontation, she explained. The founders created a system where each branch has responsibility to check the others. That doesn't mean being disrespectful, but it does mean asking difficult questions when necessary. When asked about her remarkably composed response to Roberts' outburst, she smiled slightly. In my years practicing civil rights law in Texas, I often faced judges who weren't initially receptive to my arguments. You learn quickly that responding to emotion with more emotion rarely advances your case. The most effective response is always to return to the substantive issues and the evidence supporting your position. The exchange had broader impacts on both institutional relationships and public discourse. The Supreme Court announced 2 months later that it would adopt its first formal ethics code, a step Roberts had previously resisted as unnecessary but now characterized as appropriate to maintain public confidence in the court's impartiality. While the code stopped short of creating the external review mechanism for recusal decisions that Crockett had advocated, it represented a significant shift in the court's approach to ethical transparency. Congressional oversight of the judiciary also evolved in the aftermath of the Roberts-Crockett exchange. Rather than focusing primarily on political criticism of decisions, several committee chairs began modeling their approach on Crockett's evidence-based questioning about the gap between judicial reasoning and real-world outcomes. This shift created space for more substantive dialogue between the branches while respecting appropriate institutional boundaries. For many viewers, particularly those frustrated by increasingly polarized political discourse, the exchange offered something surprisingly hopeful. A model of how institutional disagreements could be handled with substance, rather than merely emotional appeals or partisan attacks. What made this moment so significant wasn't just that Crockett effectively countered Roberts' outburst, observed a political communication expert. It's that she did so in a way that actually elevated the conversation to address fundamental constitutional questions, rather than descending into personal conflict. That's extraordinarily rare in our current political environment. Law schools and communication programs began using the clip as a case study in effective institutional dialogue. Notice that Congresswoman Crockett never took Roberts' emotional response personally, a Georgetown law professor told her class. She recognized it as an institutional reaction and responded to the underlying constitutional issues rather than the emotional display. That's a sophisticated approach with applications far beyond politics. 6 months after the hearing, the exchange continued to shape the relationship between Congress and the court. Judicial appearances before congressional committees became more substantive, with both branches showing greater willingness to engage in meaningful constitutional dialogue rather than performative confrontation. Several justices, including some of the court's most conservative members, acknowledged publicly that congressional oversight served an important constitutional function when conducted with appropriate respect for judicial independence. For ordinary citizens watching these developments, the Roberts-Crockett exchange offered a rare glimpse into how the constitutional system is supposed to work, not as separate branches engaged in partisan warfare, but as co-equal institutions engaged in an ongoing dialogue about fundamental principles, each with distinct roles in maintaining the constitutional balance. In the end, the confrontation between Chief Justice Roberts and Congresswoman Crockett revealed something essential about American constitutional governance. The system functions best not when branches defer unquestioningly to each other, but when they engage in substantive dialogue that acknowledges legitimate institutional tensions while maintaining appropriate respect. Roberts's uncharacteristic emotional outburst and Crockett's ice-cold substantive response weren't just a viral political moment. They were a vivid illustration of the ongoing constitutional conversation that has sustained American democracy for over 2 centuries. A conversation that requires both principled disagreement and mutual respect to function effectively. And that's the story of how Chief Justice Roberts' explosion and Congresswoman Crockett's ice-cold reply broke the internet while reminding Americans how constitutional dialogue between branches is supposed to work. What began as a moment of institutional conflict evolved into something much more significant. A model for how democratic governance can function even amid deep disagreements about fundamental principles. If you found this breakdown of one of the most consequential exchanges between branches of government valuable, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth analysis of the moments that are reshaping American democracy. Hit that notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we release our upcoming video. Constitutional dialogue in action when branches clash productively. Thanks for watching, and remember, in a constitutional republic, the most important conversations often begin with difficult questions asked respectfully but persistently.